Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Steve Jones at the University of Illinois, Chicago in the US.
And Steve, it's wonderful to see you after many years. You're looking well. I've already remarked on how it looks like a pretty warm autumnal day in Chicago. I don't know whether we should feel good about that or not.
There's no, so I actually grew up in Chicago. So I have some perspective. Um, Over a fairly long period of time, the climate has changed. Uh, yeah, this it is, it's no longer what I experienced when I was a child here. Um, but it is lovely today, and one of those days that you wish, I probably should have set up to do this outdoors, actually. But the
Wow.
noise would have been, it is a city.
Yeah,
So I'm not sure it would have been very good when it comes to the audio.
big time. And this is one of these moments, isn't it, when at an experiential personal level, you can say climate change is real. And you can actually be enjoying it in a certain sense while appreciating the perils it holds.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get all, sort of dance band on the Titanic about this. But you also do have to take a bit of what you can get. Um, and not otherwise, right? I mean, the other option is to get completely overwhelmed and depressed ultimately, and have no energy to push back on anything whatsoever.
And I think that's right. There is now a recognizable syndrome, if I can use that term, of, you know, climate depression,
Yeah,
especially among young people. Anyway, on that light note, let me ask you as an initial
let's
provocation.
jump off from that.
Yeah, exactly. Jump off where and into what?
Yeah.
Prof, I'd like to ask you, if I may, what's currently preoccupying, dynamizing, interesting, impeding you? What's going on for the prof?
Um, yeah. So, as you know, my interests have always been sort of absurdly broad. I'm not sure I recommend, if you're embarking on a traditional academic career, I'm not sure I recommend this, although I think for a lot of people, that's sort of the draw of it is that you can indulge these multiple interests. But it is sometimes difficult to make a case for the research that you're doing for sort of a coherent, as so many people seem to expect, if not demand, coherent explanation of your work, and I've never achieved a level of coherence in any measure, really. So, presently, a couple of things have really been occupying me. One is um, sort of a return to my interest in popular music studies, but via AI, because who isn't interested in AI right now, right? Um, but more so in the sense of how, how because music's been a bellwether for virtually every form of technology or communication technology anyway in about the last 25 years. I mean, if we take a look at everything from Napster and file sharing to the development of online communities, and so on. I'm particularly curious about what will happen to our understanding of music as a form of sharing, as a form of community, in an era in which our experience of music is uh, of music that's not shared by people, but that is given to us by way of AI and algorithms. The other sort of component of that is doing some work on what it'll mean uh, if AI generated music becomes something that we actually like. There's examples, Drake's, AI track. There's just a recent one, an, an AI generated Justin Bieber singing about Sean Combs, for instance. These things are getting massive amounts of listens. Um, I think we're on the cusp of generated AI music that will sound sufficiently professional, and I mean that in terms of audio quality, but also sufficiently professional in terms of performance and composition, that it just begs the question for me: what will it mean if we like AI generated music? Uh, what does that mean for aesthetics? What does that mean for art? Um, how do we understand our sense of taste? So that's been a uh, huge issue for me just the last year, really thinking a lot about this. Partly because I've also been teaching a seminar on AI ethics and safety. And I get the AI safety questions, um, the kind that lead to speculation about our eventual doom at the hands of AI. Maybe I'm simply not willing to acknowledge that. I mean, I acknowledge that possibility, but it's more interesting to think about the ethics of it vis-a-vis the way these sort of more pernicious ways that it finds its ways into our lives. Kind of the impact of it on everyday life through these kinds of communicative forms, whether it's music or text or images. Recent examples, to just throw out another example of uh, of a similar case. Google in its searches now incorporates AI generated images and has put up images of essentially fake mushrooms. And on the one hand, you might go, well, that's, whatever, who really cares? But people have Googled for poisonous mushrooms and have been shown images of mushrooms that don't actually exist. So you could sort of imagine the potential for somebody who may have gone foraging and asks to see, is this mushroom poisonous, kind of thing. And because one of the ways that Google search operates is you can take a photo, right? And it may now misidentify the mushroom against its generated library of images, with, you can imagine, the dire consequences. The other thing I've been thinking a lot about is not too far outside that realm as well, which is starting about 2015, I started to notice the extent to which we were communicating with our devices, literally speaking to them and them speaking back to us. Siri, I would mention some other names, but it would trigger other devices that are on my desk, and they'd start listening in to us, and started wondering about how we seem to be forming relationships with these. How they operate within our lives, but also how they are increasingly incorporated into robots, social robots in particular. And again, I mean, that's been part of the AI kind of impinging on our social relations and our everyday lives. So those have been very much kind of the when I have time to do this, because the journal that I had at New Media and Society is taking up so bloody much of my time that I almost feel like I can't even think. It's like it's like a cat that jumps into your lap and then kind of bats at your face and just won't leave you alone.
I should say this is a real-time comment from the prof, because Mr. Orange, the podcat, is making one of his regular interventions, which the prof is aware of. So you've mentioned a few things that I really wanted to get into, actually. I want to talk later about editing, but actually, before we talk more about artificial intelligence, I wanted to throw you back, as they say in baseball commentary. I don't know, were you a Cubbies fan or White Sox?
Of course. Yeah, North Side. Yeah.
Right.
Cubs.
So you've suffered.
Until 2016, my heart goes out to White Sox fans now.
I went to a game at Wrigley Field about 25 years ago, Steve, against the Dodgers, and the Cubbies were ahead about 5-2 in the top of the seventh, and everybody got up and left. including the people I was with, they said, no point staying, we go now. I said, why is that? And they said, oh, we all know the Dodgers will come back and win 7-5 or 8-5 or 6-5. So I thought, this is crazy. I've never encountered fans like this. We got on the subway, on the metro, and of course, listening on the radio, that was exactly what happened.
Yeah. You were with well-seasoned fans, I'm sorry to say.
So back, because I wanted to ask you about two early and very influential books you wrote, one called Rock Formation, which was not geological, as it were,
Yeah.
and the other Pop Music and the Press. And these are words that are hardly used anymore, pop and rock, except as sort of format choices in the case of rock for some radio stations or whatever. So I wondered if I could ask you to, as I say, go back and think about those books, but also the language of the day when rock music was, in some sense, seen by some as alternative and as presenting some kind of unified youth culture too.
Yeah.
Challenge that in lots of ways, but what's the story now?
I mean, the titles are kind of funny. The Rock Formation title was just sort of trying to have some clever wordplay, because really the book was about how popular music is formed through technology. Not both strictly in the sense of the recording process, but also in the manner in which recording technology altered how musicians, engineers, producers, etc., thought about and talked about music. You would see an effect on language when sampling came up, for instance, in the 80s. You would see different ways that musicians would speak about sound when digital delays and other digital effects became popular. So that was kind of, so the idea there was to sort of do a bit of a play on words. Pop music in the press was actually supposed to be popular music in the press, and the publisher wanted it shorter. So yeah, it's funny to me how we still actually use these terms, right? I mean, we haven't left them behind. And I think we're really quite aware of how limiting they are. I had the occasion for the first time passing through Cleveland this summer to visit the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I, I, I was struck by how revolted I was walking through this thing, and almost wanted to demand my money back for the entry fee. It was horrifyingly raucous. The extent to which this definition of rock and roll was so really 60s and 70s was stunning. It was just incredible. But we still use the terms, right? I mean, both kind of commercially in the ways that radio stations still use it, and the ways that publications still use it. It's still out there, and in the way that my students use it. It's hard to get away from it because it is kind of all encompassing. Unless you're curating the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
In which case, it's basically white guys, right?
It's white guys with guitars. Yeah. And similarly, a term like pop now has come to encompass so much as well, which is really fascinating. I've always had an interest in how we talk about music, because it tells us something about our values, what it means to us, how important it is to us, or unimportant, and how we determine things like our sense of authenticity with regard to it, and how much or whether that authenticity matters, right? I mean, some of the most interesting music phenomena happening now have to do with virtual performers. Um, um, so trying to understand, if you've ever been to a concert with Hatsune Miku, for instance, and you see this, it's basically just a projection on a screen. Large, by and large, most of these are using some version of Pepper's Ghost for a 3D effect. But the audience response is no different than it would be to a live performer. And that's really remarkable. I mean, I certainly remember the sort of backlash that, the first time I saw New Order, just to throw that out as an example, and songs would start without any of the band actually doing anything but triggering a sequencer and a drum machine. People in the audience were visibly unhappy with this. So, yeah, looking at a virtual performer now, we've gone 180 degrees opposite.
I'm thinking, Prof, of the recently released Beatles song Now and Then, which is a melange of, a cassette tape of John Lennon sometime before he died, aborted recording sessions with George Harrison sometime before he died, imagery of the Beatles from 50 years ago, and imagery of Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr allegedly playing the music now, and using technology devised by Peter Jackson's group that had enabled them to remake Let It Be and create the Get Back movies, which were meant to be instances of technology going into an archive and resuscitating the real. But in the case of Now and Then, are used to fabricate something. I mean, something that I happen to like. But do you know what I mean?
So that's a really interesting example. I've actually done a fair bit of digging into this because it's absolutely fascinating.
Oh, okay. Carry on. Yeah.
So, first things first, right? Kind of full disclosure. I'm an enormous Beatles fan, just huge, and I've done my level best to dig up every possible, alternate take, bootleg, what have you, because I love hearing the chronology of how a song and an album develop. I mean, it's just a fascinating. Strawberry Fields is one of the greatest examples, and there are bootlegs out there that have this home demo that then evolves into the final product. It's just incredible how this transformation takes place. I loved the remastered versions of albums, regardless of what technology was used, because they it's akin to looking at something through a window, and then having somebody use a good glass cleaner and seeing again much more clearly what's on the other side. The remastered versions, the ones that Giles Martin has done the last few years, are remarkable that way.
Revolver. Yep.
Yeah, incredible. I mean, the detail that you hear. On the other hand, when I go back and listen to the original versions, I don't mind that I'm missing some of this. But I'm happy having both versions. Here's the interesting thing to me with Now and Then, and with Free as a Bird, that came before it, I'm blanking on the title of the other song, Real Love, all from the same cassette tape, actually, that they were given by Yoko of John doing home demos. On the one hand, I don't begrudge a real desire to make music again as the Beatles. I mean, it's really remarkable to be able to do that sort of thing. It's on the other hand, it's also a little bit creepy. And it must have just been, as Paul and George said during the anthology, broadcast, they had to think of it as if John had come in and done his bit and then left, and then they came in and did it. Because, yeah, I mean, if you think of it any more deeply than that, I think it's going to be too strange, really, to proceed, and be not overwhelmed by the emotions that I'm sure would be there. Um, Now and then is a completely different beast, though, because what you have in this case is not only the recording of John and the recording of George posthumously, but when as I dug a little deeper, what the AI was able to do in this case, thanks to Peter Jackson's um, uh, technology, was not his technology, but the technology he paid for lack of a better way to put it, was to not only separate out the individual stems, or the voice, the piano, and the guitar, and so on, but was also able to take the sound of those separate tracks and recreate them as if they belonged there. So it's one thing to say that AI was used to separate out the individual pieces and then be able to treat those and remix them. It's a completely different thing to say that now that the AI has them, it's able to learn a style and a sound and reincorporate or reinsert AI generated audio. And that's what's happening in this case. Right? There was an engine. I don't know, I haven't followed it to see what happened to this person, but there was an engineer from Jackson's company who essentially said what they were able to do was create a model and use that to fill in bits, right? Rather than simply, because there were apparently parts where once they separated out the individual tracks, it still wasn't good enough. Right? You still didn't have good enough audio quality, or maybe you had some dropouts. So the AI was able to go back in and reinsert material that sounded essentially identical. And we're now entering a very strange realm, because you could basically say, well, what the AI is doing here is acting as a Beatle. I find that completely fascinating. I'm not revolted, interestingly, but I also don't want to hear, a model of the Beatles making music. That's sort of beyond the pale, and I'm still sort of, inquiring of myself how and why draw those lines.
There's a famous line by Muddy Waters when he was asked about the Stones, and he said, "They stole my music, but they gave me my name."
Yeah.
Because of the way in which these white British groups of the 60s had, as you know, art school teachers who would go to the US in the summer and buy what were called race records and bring them back. And so when the so-called British invasion happened, one of the myths about it is that these white journalists would be asked, where does your music come from? What are you interested in? And they'd say, great bluesmen. They would say Muddy Waters, or they would say Chuck Berry even, who wasn't known. So there is a sense in which I think with these famous white British examples of the Stones and the Beatles, there are massive echoes of voices that come from entirely different geographies and experiences and racial histories, no?
Yeah, but I mean that's music, right? I mean that's once it's out there, right? Once it's public, all sorts of things happen to it. And to me, one of the enormously understudied and underappreciated areas in popular music studies is distribution. We've done a great deal of work on consumption. How we listen, why we listen, what we listen to, et cetera, et cetera. We've done some work on production, and we've paid almost no attention to distribution. There's a wonderful book from either I can't remember the exact publication, but it was Christopher Malm and Roger Wallace, who wrote a book called Big Sounds from Small Peoples. And it essentially looked at how recording technologies like the cassette tape enabled very local music cultures to not only create music, but also to disseminate it and to share it. In 40, 50 years before we had MP3s and file sharing as we understand it now. And that ability to kind of hear and share music from other places so easily compared. I mean, it wasn't a question of muddy waters. The way that the Rolling Stones and the Beatles were hearing these types of music that were coming from the U.S. In the case of the Beatles in particular, had to do with living in a port city, and having sailors who'd come back with records, and the Rolling Stones, they were writing to Chess Records in Chicago and ordering from the catalog. Simply the era of recording made the difference. That you could now hear these types of music and not be kind of locked into. And of course, then you'd want to play them, but you could never play them the same way as you heard them on the record. So you make your own.
I wanted to ask you a question about algorithms, a
Yeah.
topic that you, in a sense, touched on en passant before. So 40 years ago, when I was or 45 years ago, 47 years ago, when I started college, I had a job, in fact, throughout college for a radio station that was a mixture of AOR, adult-oriented rock, and easy listening. We had the incredibly unfortunate slogan, which was a real winner, as you can imagine, of good radio. You'd listen to that, wouldn't you, Steve? Anyway.
All the time. All day, every day.
Our playlist was, we got singles every week from the record labels. And we had a guy about my age, actually, who ran the library and stole from it, who would go through and classify things as being sufficiently adult or sufficiently easy listening. So it was a bit sort of maniacal, right? And with records, with LP records, what we would do would be we'd write on a bit of paper that was attached to the album cover which tracks we'd played to make sure that the next dude coming in would not play the same track. And we'd also note how often the single was played. Quite scientific in its own way, scientific management, worked pretty well, different technologically, but symbolically and administratively, not that dissimilar to what we get today.
I want to take I want to take the algorithm back to this notion of, what we were saying with like the Beatles and the Stones, getting these records from, the Muddy Waters or the Willie Dixon or Chuck Berry, whatever it might have been, and then kind of hearing it and then processing it and creating their own music. Essentially, right, what they were doing, what the Beatles and the Stones and countless other bands, the Yardbirds, whoever, they were being their own algorithms, right? I mean, what they're doing, right, is essentially hearing an input, right, and then outputting something else. I mean, this is what AI does, right? It gets this material that it's given, and it processes it in some way, largely unknown, right? And that's a whole nother conversation. And it comes up with something similar, but different. Well, that's what musicians do.
Yeah.
I mean, historically, for as long as we've had music, I'm completely certain that is what happens. But now machines are doing this, right? Now, the question for me then is, how good are they going to be? And what if they're actually really good at this? What does that mean? How do we contend with this? On an ethical and aesthetic level. What does this mean? I mean, they're probably not going to. You could say, well, they're not going to play live. To which I would kind of, well, they could. Depends on what you mean by live, right? I mean, if you go see, I'd say Mika or some other virtual performer, why couldn't you create an avatar that would, perform the music in some sense? So, that's in some ways that's actually easy to contend with. The more difficult thing for me to contend with is what'll happen to how we value music and to our taste, and what'll happen to how we share our music. What I mean by that is not physically or materially how do we share it, but here's generally the way that things have worked, at least in popular music, but I suspect in other forms too. If I hear a song that I like, right, I want to share it with you. Right? I want to say, hey, Toby, this song is so great. Right? Check this out. But now I have an AI that's basically saying to me, hey, I'm going to make songs for you that you think are great. But they're going to be tailored to me. So my sharing those becomes a different matter. Right? I'm going to have enough songs that I think are great. Am I going to want to bother hearing other people? I mean, do I want to hear Toby? Do I want you to say, hey, Steve, these are great songs. I love these songs. These songs were made for me. And to which my response could be, well, yeah, but I've got these other great songs that were made for me. Why do I want to hear songs that are made for you? So, there are these kind of subtle shifts in what music means in relation to our taste, right? And our aesthetic and artistic sensibilities, particularly when this technology gets good enough, and it's just about good enough, actually, to be able to do this.
Do these things. Let me change tack, Prof, because I know that you've got another meeting upcoming, which can't be nearly as important as this one, but nevertheless.
It's not going to be nearly as much fun, no, because it is actually a meeting, it's not a conversation.
And I would actually like to talk to you about Greg Maddox, but we can do that another time. Let's
I want to talk about Imanaga and Shohei Ohtani, but okay.
Okay, well, you see, that's a bit after my time, unfortunately. Here in Spain, we're not looking at the 50-50 record in the same way that you are. You mentioned earlier, and this is a bit more burdensome from what you said, editing. It's over 25 years since you founded the spectacularly successful, path-breaking journal New Media and Society. And you've also edited numerous book series. I wanted to ask you, when you mentioned, editing is taking up so much of your time and energy, what's changed over that quarter of a century? Because my sense is that more and more labor is required of authors, editors, and reviewers. Less and less labor is provided by publishers, and there is more and more surveillance of what we do.
Yeah. So I think you could look at this from a couple of different angles. One is that we have so rapidly scaled up the study of new media that it's almost impossible to keep pace on a strictly from the standpoint of the labor that's necessary. I can tell you this, which is that literally moments ago, before we started this conversation, the 1,500th submission to New Media Society came
Congratulations and commiserations simultaneously.
in. Please, no congratulations. A year ago, the 1500th did not come in until mid-November. So this is still exponentially growing, right? In terms of the amount of work that's being generated. The amount of people who are available to do the editorial work involved is not exponentially growing. It's hard to reconcile this, right? Because if there are that many more articles or at least manuscripts, right, papers being written, who's writing this many more papers if there aren't this many more people in the field? It's just stunning. Publishers, the publishers that I work with, I'm fortunate to say are not for profit, and are supporting with what profits they make philanthropic goals. I'd be hard pressed to. Well, it's not hard pressed. I don't think it would be possible for me to work for Springer or some other. It just doesn't make sense to me to do that sort of thing. Publishers actually do still provide a lot of support, right? I mean, to take things back to the late 1980s, I actually launched what is now the Journal of Popular Music Studies. At the time, it was called Tracking Popular Music Studies. So it's an outgrowth of the U.S. branch of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music. And it was virtually entirely hand-produced. And it was plausible to do that at the time. And you sort of think now, if you have, with all the resources that are available for publishing online, this should be even more readily possible. But you still need an infrastructure. Somebody still has to do things like coming up with DOIs, with putting stuff online, with formatting, with copy editing, with managing these processes, with managing the editorial process, and so on. No matter how you slice it, labor is involved. And publishers still put in a lot of work. So, your mileage may vary depending on, the quality of the publisher, whether the publisher is for profit, not for profit, the size of the thing, that's involved. I mean, I'm all for open access, and we have options. I mean, with New Media Society, if you're from an institution or a country that has open access agreements and mandates, you will publish open access in New Media Society. If you're from a non-OECD country, you will publish open access in New Media Society, and literally in every Sage journal. I shouldn't just single out New Media Society. If you're from none of those, however, there is an OA fee, and it's hard to know. Kind of, I don't have a crystal ball here. I don't really follow scholarly publishing. I am dubious that we're going to have some kind of breakthrough that will permit open access and almost no labor. Somebody's going to have to do the work.
These for-profit companies are making so much money. Their profits.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what they've been really good at is not so much exploiting labor as exploiting the revenue from selling the product. And I think the bottom's going to drop out of that before long. I don't know what's going to replace it. I literally have no idea, but that's yet to play out, particularly when there are demands for open access publishing now that'll come from the U.S. federal government. Um, we'll see how that actually ends up
Yes,
shaking
because
out.
what the US government and some others are saying is, hey, we pay for a lot of this research to be done. You publish it and make money from it, selling to libraries, which we're also subsidizing.
Right,
And we're
right,
subsidizing the salaries of the people who write this stuff. What is going on?
right. No, it's a funny thing. I mean, I think back to when I was working as a journalist too. I was getting paid 10 cents, 50 cents, a dollar a word. Um, I'll now write an 8,000 word journal article for which I'll get 0 cents a word. On the other hand, this is also what we should be doing, right? I mean, part of what I take it I'm paid for as an academic, right, as a scholar, is producing this kind of work, but also reviewing it, and doing this kind of editorial work too. This is to me what it means to be part of the scholarly community and part of the scholarly conversation. So, from that standpoint, I think I'm pretty well compensated for that type of work. I am, uh, uh, not very happy when that work is then further exploited, kind of a second order exploitation, um, and kind of sold on and compiled into, or as more recently is the case, right? That I think it was Taylor and Francis, although I don't want to be speaking out of turn necessarily, that is apparently putting all of their material available to OpenAI for use in large language models. Um, I didn't agree to that, did I? I don't remember that ever being part of a contributor agreement that I signed, um, and I don't think that's fair. That is not something that you should be able to do with the words that I wrote without my agreement.
For sure. So, Prof, I'm conscious of time. I have one more question for you, and then I'd like to throw it over to you to add anything you might wish. And that could take the form of something new that we haven't discussed, or of revisiting something we have mentioned. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things to a close?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fine. I suppose, as I look back, here's maybe what concerns me is, when I look across the ways in which um, the field of communication, broadly speaking, has developed and the ways that it's professionalized. I am somewhat concerned that we maybe have too greatly professionalized. And what I mean by that is, you know, uh, one of the things that drew me to communication, um, because I was also at the same time contemplating um, pursuing a degree in computer science or in music, um, was the communication was so broad that I could pursue so many different interests, and tie them together or not. And as time has gone on, I find the field kind of becoming somewhat more rigid in its understanding of what communication is. And I'll give you, my favorite example is now roughly 10 or so years old, which is that when I first started talking about what I term human machine communication, our engagements with technology as interlocutor, as conversational partner, as something with which we can have a relationship. Um, I would find people in the field would have an almost visceral reaction and say, things along the lines of, in fact, I mean, you know me, I'm not one to sort of court controversy and disagreement, for its own sake. I would have people who would get up and walk out of a talk and say, this doesn't belong in the state of communication. This is not human communication. Why would we even have this this belongs in computer science. This belongs in engineering. This belongs somewhere else. This is not communication is a study of human communication. We shouldn't be countenancing this kind of thing. And and I think that's wrong. I think that's simply wrong. I mean, it is human communication, number one, because there's a human involved. That's akin to saying, well, we shouldn't study communication with our pets or with animals. And in fact, if you look across the field, there's precious little work in that area. I don't understand why not. Almost everybody who has a pet. I'd go out on the limb and say, look, everybody who has a pet of any sort, right, any species, talks to it. It doesn't talk back, right? It'll bark, it'll meow, it'll chirp, it'll do whatever it does. But we're still going to treat that utterance as if it was speech, right? As if it was speaking to us in some fashion. Why are we not studying this? Similarly, we need to be studying how AI, how robots, how digital assistants are communicating with us. This is important stuff because we're treating it, right, as communication. Why are scholars not going to treat it the same way?
I'm reminded, Prof, of Wittgenstein saying something along the lines of, if the lion could speak, we would not understand what he had to say. Of course,
and this is where AI is taking us, right?
Well, one of the promises of AI at the moment is that it says something that you and I probably find incredible. We will enable you to understand your cat. Good luck with that one, dude. Could be a stretch. We'll see.
Do we want to know?
Well, that's the other question. With this notion of, total knowledge one click away, of course, it's a lie, because knowledge involves understanding and experience, as well as words and numbers. But B, what is this imperialistic desire about? Again, not wanting to get into male psychology, but look at these guys being reproduced within the Silicon Valley machinery and what comes out of their mouths about their understanding of society. It is 19th century eugenics, basically, over and over and over again. And so I'm not concerned personally about artificial intelligence. I'm very concerned about the people who are trying to run it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all we have to do is look at Elon Musk. But just yesterday, OpenAI, which had been dedicated to literally to OpenAI, to a transparent effort to understand, develop AI, is now for profit, and all of its board have left, and Sam Altman is now in charge.
And of course, Google gobbled up one of the not-for-profit competitors. Well, Prof. Steve Jones, I know.
I think we've gone back to the Titanic here.
We have, and we've ended on that demoralizing note that old gentlemen often find themselves agreeing on. But your work is dynamic, it's exciting, it's always been, to use the cliche, the cutting edge. And I know you'll come up with some great answers to these problems. No pressure.
No, no. Here's what I hope I'll come up with. Right? I hope I'll come up with ways to inspire students to come up with those things.
Beautifully put, sir. Thanks again, Steve. Always wonderful to learn from you, whether it's reading to you or listening, reading you or listening to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a real treat. I truly appreciate it.